There are quite a few names in this video, and I've done my best to keep it nice and simple. Lisa Rene was a 16-year-old student who lived in Arlington, Texas. Lisa had dreams of becoming a doctor. She was an honor student who studied hard, and her future seemed to be very promising. On the night of the 24th of December 1994, Lisa was home alone studying for an up-and-coming test. She was sat on the floor with textbooks laid out all over, when all of a sudden, there was a knock at the door. Lisa got up and she asked who was there. Behind the door were two men, Bruce Webster, aged 21, and Demetrius Hall, aged 19. Lisa began to worry as she had no idea who the men were, so she called her sister Pearl and asked her what she should do. Pearl lived with Lisa but was working this night, and she told Lisa to call the police immediately. The men refused to leave and they claimed to be part of the FBI. While Lisa was on the phone with the dispatcher, Bruce began to kick the door down, and Lisa began to scream down the phone to the operator. As Bruce was kicking the front door, Demetrius walked round to the back of the property. He looked through the sliding glass door on the patio and saw that Lisa was on the phone. Demetrius swung his baseball bat and shattered the glass patio door. The operator heard Lisa frantically screaming and a man saying, "Who are you on the phone to?" The line then goes dead. The men entered the apartment, grabbed Lisa and dragged her to a car. The police arrived within minutes, but the men and Lisa were already gone. So, who were these men and why were they there? Well, Lisa had two brothers, and those brothers had been involved in some rather shady activity. They had taken part in a deal that had gone very wrong with some very dangerous people. A 23-year-old man named Orlando Hall ran a drug trafficking enterprise in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. His partners in this enterprise included his younger brother Demetrius Hall, Bruce Webster, Marvin Holloway, and Stephen Beckley. On the 21st of September, 3 days before Lisa was kidnapped, Orlando took a flight to Dallas, Texas to engage in a drug transaction. When Orlando arrived, he was met by Stephen and his younger brother Demetrius. Orlando had taken this trip to meet up with two local drug dealers, and these dealers were Lisa's brothers, Stanfield Vitalis and Neil Rene. The gang met up with Neil and Stanfield and gave them $4,700 to purchase some drugs from them. The plan was to hand over the money and then later they would meet back up with Neil and Stanfield to receive the drugs. So as planned late that day, Marvin and Demetrius made their way back to meet with Neil and Stanfield, but they were nowhere to be seen. Marvin and Demetrius waited, but they never arrived. They reported back to Orlando, who was of course not very happy about the situation. Eventually, Orlando managed to get hold of Neil and Stanfield on the phone. The brothers told Orlando that they had been robbed and that the people who had robbed them had stolen their car and the $4,700 that had been given to them. Orlando didn't fully believe the story, so he contacted one of his friends who worked at a telephone company. And using the phone number that Neil and Stanfield had used, he was able to get their address, and traced the address to an apartment in Arlington, Texas. Orlando, Marvin and Demetrius made their way to the apartment where the brothers lived. They waited outside and watched. After observing the area for some time, they saw Neil and Stanfield enter and exit the apartment on numerous occasions in their car. The car, which they claimed to have been stolen along with the money. Orlando concluded that both Neil and Stanfield had lied about the whole thing and that they had stolen the money from him. On the 24th of September, the day that Lisa was kidnapped, Orlando told one of his friends, a man named Bruce Webster, to fly to Texas and to make his way to Arlington. Bruce had a reputation for being a very dangerous person, and he allegedly worked as a hitman. On the evening of the 24th, Orlando, Demetrius, Bruce, and Stephen made their way to the apartments, armed with guns, baseball bats, duct tape, and gasoline. The men had driven to the apartment in Orlando's sister's Cadillac. Orlando's sister had no idea they had taken her car. The plan was to steal Orlando's sister's car without her realizing, drive over to the apartment, break in, tie the brothers up, and burn them alive. So the men approached the apartment and knocked on the door. Lisa refused to open as she was home alone. Pearl was working and Neil and Stanfield had gone to a concert and were out of town. When Lisa called 911, Bruce and Demetrius broke into the apartment and dragged her into the car and drove away. The police and Lisa's sister Pearl made their way to the apartment in minutes after Lisa had called them, but as I said earlier, they were already gone. Lisa was being driven away by the men, and frustratingly, as the police drove to the scene, they drove right past the Cadillac. At the apartment, the police asked Pearl if she knew anyone who would want to harm Lisa, but Pearl couldn't think of anyone. Lisa wasn't a criminal, and she had no enemies. But Pearl did tell the police that her brothers Neil and Stanfield had recently been kicked out of their apartment for selling drugs, and that they had recently moved in with her and Lisa. The police speculated that this could have something to do with the kidnap. The police wanted to speak with either Neil or Stanfield right away, so they asked Pearl to call them on their cell phone. The police asked the brothers if they had been involved in any illegal activities that could have led to the kidnap of Lisa. Both Neil and Stanfield said they didn't owe any money to anyone and they had no idea who could have taken their little sister. The detectives working on the case asked some of the local residents around the apartment complex if they had seen anything suspicious, and indeed, they had. Residents had seen an unfamiliar Cadillac and 4 men lurking around the complex wearing camouflaged clothing. Despite saying they had no idea who had taken their sister, the next morning, Neil and Stanfield called the detectives working on the kidnapping of Lisa. They said that they had found the Cadillac parked outside a house in Irving, Texas. This pretty much confirmed to the police that the brothers knew more than they were letting on. Investigators made their way to the house in Irving that the brothers had told them about, and like they said, the Cadillac was parked outside. Investigators knocked on the door and a woman answered. She told them that her husband was at work, but that they were more than welcome to come inside and to conduct a quick search of the property. The search was conducted, but they didn't find anything that they could work with, so the investigators left. With precious minutes going by and still no leads, the police told the brothers that they needed to be honest and to tell them everything they knew, because if they didn't, they may never see their little sister again. The brothers finally complied. They told the investigators about the drug deal with the gang and that they had stolen their money, but they said they didn't know much about them or their names. On the 27th of September, the police received a new tip, and this time from the husband of the woman who allowed them to search their home in Irving. The man was convinced that his wife's brothers had something to do with the disappearance of Lisa. He told the police that his wife's brothers were called Orlando and Demetrius, and that the 2 brothers were involved in some very shady activities, and on the night that Lisa was taken, Orlando and Demetrius had been at their house and staying with them for a couple of days. The man explained that on the night that Lisa went missing, he and his wife had gone out for some food, and that it was possible that the brothers had taken his Cadillac. He told the investigators that Orlando and Demetrius had since left their house, and that they should also check out their friend Stephen Beckley. The man then said that the investigators were welcome to come back to his house to conduct a more thorough search. While searching the house in Irving, the police found a baseball bat, and lodged in the baseball bat were small fragments of glass. This of course piqued their interest, since the glass door of Lisa's apartment had been smashed. Inside the Cadillac, they also found small fragments of glass. The glass found was analysed, and they discovered that it matched the smashed glass back at the apartment. Warrants for the arrest of Orlando, Demetrius and Stephen were issued. Demetrius and Stephen were the first to be arrested. They both refused to disclose much information. They wouldn't say where Orlando was or if Lisa was still alive. What Stephen did say was that they had gotten help from a hitman named Bruce Webster, and that they had taken Lisa to a motel in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Detectives went to the motel to look for clues. While the police were there, Bruce Webster just so happened to pull up with his girlfriend, looking to stay the night at the motel. Bruce was instantly recognized and was quickly arrested too. Once Orlando saw that the others were arrested on TV, he turned himself in. What exactly happened to Lisa was soon revealed. Between them, the men gave details of what happened that night. After smashing the glass door and kidnapping Lisa in Arlington, the group then drove their Cadillac back to Orlando's sister's apartment in Irving. Once there, they exited the Cadillac and forced Lisa into the backseat of Stephen Beckley's car. The group then got into the car and drove around. During this drive, the men took turns forcing themselves upon Lisa. After this drive, Orlando was dropped off at his sister's home again. He stayed there for the night and would fly back to Arkansas the next day. After dropping Orlando off, Stephen, Bruce, and Demetrius drove Lisa to Pine Bluff. When the group arrived at Pine Bluff, they paid for a motel room, and once inside, they tied Lisa up and repeatedly forced themselves upon her. Orlando and his other partner in crime, Marvin Holloway, arrived at the motel room on Sunday morning, the 25th of September. They went into the bathroom with Lisa to speak with her for around 20 minutes. When Orlando came out, he told the group that he had decided that she knew too much and they couldn't just let her go. They decided that Lisa needed to die. Later that afternoon, Stephen and Orlando made their way to Bird Lake Park, and there, they prepared a grave for Lisa. After digging the grave, the men went back to the motel to get Lisa to bring her to the grave and kill her. But in the darkness of the night, they couldn't locate the pre-dug grave, so they returned to the motel with Lisa. On the morning of Monday, September the 26th, Lisa was nearly saved. The motel security guard had knocked on the door of their room and asked if everything was okay. Someone had reported that noise was coming from their room. Because the security guard was growing suspicious, Stephen and Demetrius thought it would be best to move Lisa to another motel. Later on, Orlando, Bruce, and Stephen drove Lisa to Bird Lake Park again. Demetrius stayed at the motel and scrubbed the place clean. The men placed a mask over Lisa's face so she couldn't see, and they escorted her to the pre-dug grave. Lisa became scared and tried to run away, but Stephen managed to grab her and she fell to the ground. Stephen then used a shovel to hit Lisa over the head twice. Orlando and Bruce then took the shovel and began taking turns hitting Lisa with it. At this point, Lisa was rendered unconscious. The men then gagged her and threw her into the grave and covered her over. They buried Lisa alive. The men then returned to the motel and picked up Demetrius. Stephen agreed to take the police to the site where they killed Lisa, and her body was exhumed. The autopsy concluded that she had died from asphyxiation from being buried alive. The cruelty of this case is nothing short of horrific. When Lisa was killed, she was in the process of studying hard to become a doctor to help save people's lives. In exchange for a lesser sentence, Demetrius, Stephen, and Marvin pleaded guilty and testified against Orlando and Bruce. Although Marvin Holloway didn't take part in the actual murder of Lisa, he was present at times in the motel and he received a 15-year sentence. He was released from prison on the 2nd of May 2008. Stephen was sentenced to 30 years and was released from prison on the 21st of April 2020. Demetrius received a sentence of 25 years and was released from prison on the 2nd of August 2016. Orlando and Bruce were sentenced to death. In 2019, Bruce Webster's death sentence was overturned after he was found to have severe learning difficulties. The brothers of Lisa, Neil and Stanfield would later admit that if they had spoken to the police sooner, Lisa may still be alive today. On the 19th of November 2020, Orlando Hall was executed by lethal injection. After he was put to death, Lisa's sister Pearl released a statement. She said, "Today marks the end of a very long and painful chapter. My family and I are relieved that this is now over. We have been dealing with this for over 26 years and now we're having to relive the tragic nightmare that our beloved Lisa went through. This is only the end of the legal aftermath. The execution of Orlando Hall will never stop the suffering we continue to endure. We pray for our family as well as his."